Okay, go.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We have had a couple of, as Jill touched on, a couple of technical difficulties this afternoon. So I'm going to try and share my screen now, which is not something I love doing, I have to say, on Teams. But hopefully this will work. Just 1 second. Excellent. Right, hopefully then everybody should now have a slideshow.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I am Ruth Marie Mackrodt and from Wool Insulation Wales, and I'd like to thank Kate for inviting me to give this webinar this afternoon, and for all of you taking time out of your schedules to listen. This afternoon, I am going to talk to you a little bit about the construction industry and the built environment, and how the materials we choose to use within those can have a very significant impact on CO2 emissions. Now, just by definition of being on the webinar means that everyone listening knows that being green matters. But I thought it would be useful to give a quick reminder of what we are facing. And I know that Jill touched on this in her presentation a little earlier. So despite all the recycling, electric cars, renewable energy, and goodness knows, all of these things are extremely important. Just prior to COP28 a month ago, the United Nations announced that if the world continues on its current path, with all the good things that we are currently doing, the world will see an increase in temperature of 3 degrees by the end of the century, less than 70 years away. And 3 degrees temperature increase represents a 5-degree land temperature increase, which in turn represents an 8-degree urban temperature increase. The United Nations called this a hellish scenario, and it really would be. I think we all know that we would see large movements of people, massive interruptions in the food supply, and huge rises in sea levels. That is if we continue on our current path. Now, within the UK, one of the most significant contributors to greenhouse gases is the built environment. It is responsible for around 30% of our emissions every year. Globally, in fact, the figure is a little higher than that, at around 40%, but in the UK it sits around 30%. And of that 30%, 1/3 is actually the carbon emissions used to make the materials we use in those buildings. So not the heat and the light that goes to running them, that's the operational carbon, but actually the embodied carbon of materials. And this chart shows you how much progress we have made in reducing the embodied carbon of materials over the last 35 years. And the answer is not very much. We have managed to reduce it by a grand total of around 17%, which means that in the next 25 years, we are going to have to do a lot more and a lot quicker. In terms of actually what that means in terms of numbers, the embodied carbon emissions from our building materials every year is represented by 43 billion kilograms of CO2. And the chart below that will just show you how very far we are off target. The pathway set there is a pathway to net zero, which was set by the UK Climate Change Committee, and it's their balanced pathway to net zero. And you can see that we are very far off that target. And this is really how far we need to get to. At the moment in the UK, the average house contains around 800 kilograms of embodied carbon emissions per square metre. And the very best low embodied carbon housing we can build today contains around 150 kilograms of embodied carbon per square metre. And if we're to get to anything like net zero, we are going to have to learn to build at less than 7 kilograms of embodied carbon per square metre. So if we're going to have to get anywhere close, we are going to have to completely rethink the materials that we build with. And this is especially true given the urgent need for new housing. Because if the UK was to embark on the kind of house building programme it so desperately needs without changing how it builds, you could easily see the emissions figures for construction's contribution rise, not fall. And even the housing stock that we currently have poses very particular problems. In the UK, our housing is, in general terms, older and leakier than many of our European neighbours. And that means that in order to make it more energy efficient, we have to use more materials to insulate it. Now, when I mentioned rethinking the materials we use, one of the most obvious choices to use are bio-based materials such as wool. It's very easy, I think of natural products as somehow simple, less sophisticated than man-made materials. But they are not. They have been thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years in development in the very harshest testing lab that there is. If you think for a minute of all the failures of man-made building products over the last few decades, asbestos, high alumina cement, and the recent issues around RAAC. If wool had failed as an insulating material, it wouldn't exist. It would have been evolved out of existence. Sheep are actually the second animal domesticated by humans, and they have been with us around 12,000 years. So wool is familiar and it is everyday. But it is also, in the true scientific sense, a smart technical fibre which reacts to the conditions around it, making it an ideal material for construction. Now, it won't surprise anybody that wool is a superb thermal insulator. It is comparable or better to both stone wool or glass wool, and it is also an excellent acoustic insulator. But in a warming climate, management of cold is not the only thing that you want from an insulating material. You also want something that will manage heat successfully. And wool does this far, far better than man-made products. It has a very high thermal mass and a very high specific heat capacity, which means that it basically transfers heat far more slowly from the outside of a building to the inside of a building. Because in the end, what insulation tries to achieve is the greatest level of comfort for a building's occupants for as much of the time as possible, using as little energy as possible. And wool does this very successfully in winter and in summer. But wool also has some other technical aspects that make it particularly interesting as a construction material. The outside of a wool fibre is hydrophobic, so it repels water in liquid form. But the inside of a wool fibre is hygroscopic. And hygroscopicity is the ability to be able to absorb water in vapour form in times of high humidity and release it in times of low humidity. And this is exactly what you want in a building. Water in buildings, besides things like floods and your roof tiles falling off, water in buildings is primarily in vapour form. The showers we take, the cooking we do, the kettles we boil, and the air we breathe in and out. And hygroscopicity is critical in managing damp and humidity. And damp, as well as temperature, have significant effects on human health. And the current cost in the NHS of dealing with illnesses associated with cold and damp conditions runs into tens of millions of pounds every year. And this ability of wool to be able to handle moisture is not really surprising if you think about it, because wool has evolved to keep sheep warm, whether they live in a warm or dry climate. And let's face it, in the last few months, the rainfall has certainly evidenced that. And wool also has one or two other abilities that are never found in man-made materials. It has the ability to absorb and lock away volatile organic compounds, things like formaldehyde. And these chemicals are found in construction products, they're found a lot in furniture, and they're found a great deal in cleaning materials. And they are respiratory irritants that cause illness in humans. And the ability of sheep wool to be able to absorb these and lock them away is a strong contributor to a healthy indoor environment for us. Now, it's incredibly important, obviously, that we reuse, we recycle, and we repurpose man-made materials so that we can extract every bit of use out of them for as long as we can. But in the end, we're going to have to use more and more truly circular materials, and that very often means bio-based materials. There are 30 million sheep sheared in the UK every year, making it clearly a local and renewable raw material, and more than 10 million of these are in Wales. And in fact, Wales has more sheep than the US and Canada combined. Wool is today a byproduct of the meat industry. And in fact, its value has fallen so much over the last 30 years that in reality it is a waste product. And across the EU, between 70 and 90% of the wool clip is buried in the ground every year, simply because it is not economically worth it for farmers to transport that wool and to sell it. In the UK, many sheep graze in upland areas are unsuitable for growing cereal crops and food crops, and they are strong contributors to biodiversity in that area. But wool is also a carbon store, so the grass absorbs carbon dioxide, the sheep eat the grass, and at least part of that they turn into wool. Wool is actually 50% carbon, and it is a carbon sink. And at the end of life, wool insulation can be composted and returning nutrients to the soil, which does make it a material of the circular economy. I wanted to share with you some real life figures about the impact of what some of our materials choices can mean in terms of CO2 emissions. This chart was prepared based on data prepared by for a research paper by Cardiff University in 2019. And it shows the kilograms of CO2 emissions per meter cubed of various insulating materials. And you will see there are some very stark differences there. PIR at nearly 120 kilograms per meter cubed, going through stone wool and glass wool at about 44, down to sheep's wool about 0.8. And how that translates in terms of an average semi-detached house, assuming it needs 50 square meters of insulation. The difference that you make, the difference that you create when you make different choices between PIR and, say, sheep's wool, you are making a contribution of saving more than 5,200 kilograms of CO2. But wool has other benefits that go to the heart of a fair and green transition as well. In 2022, the cost to shear a sheep in the UK was around £1.30. And the money received by Welsh farmers in the same year on average was around 11p. And clearly that is a huge drag on the rural economy. Within Wales, that comes to the tune of tens of millions of pounds per year. And everyone on this call will either have sheep or know someone who has sheep. And we all know that the rural economy is under huge pressure. And wool's use in construction is one of the very few industries that has the volumes necessary to change the wool price and recirculate funds back into the rural economy. And it is therefore a perfect example of how a shift to a circular economy material can add real, local, measurable economic value and be a fair choice as well as a green choice. Now, bio-based materials do nearly always cost more. Anybody who's looked at the price tag of a wool jumper versus a polyester jumper knows this to be true. In the end, governments and organisations and individuals need to make a choice, and financial cost is, of course, part of that choice. But I would leave you with the thought that many man-made materials come with a huge economic cost as well. It's just those are not factored into the sales price. The use of circular economy materials is all around sustainable development, meeting the needs of the present without preventing the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Given where we are today, the needs of future generations isn't some point in the distant future, but our children's needs, and for many of you who are a lot younger than I am, about your own needs. And I hope this has given you an example of how just sheerly changing the materials that we choose to make can have a very significant impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth Marie. I think you're going to have to take the questions. I think if you stop sharing and then everybody can turn